Around 4,200 years ago, on the steppes near the Volga River, humans began breeding a particular population of horses that would eventually spread across Eurasia. These horses became the ancestors of the domestic horses we know today, changing how humans traveled, fought wars, traded, and farmed. Meanwhile, zebras took a very different evolutionary path in Africa. They're close relatives of horses. They graze on grass, they live in herds, and at a glance, their bodies look remarkably similar. So you'd think humans would have found a way to put them to work too, but that's not what happened. There were no zebra cavalry, no zebra-drawn plows, and no civilizations built around riding them. So how did two animals that look almost the same end up with completely different stories? One became a partner to humans and helped reshape civilization, while the other stayed wild. So what made horses so different? To understand this, we first need to see just how similar horses and zebras really are. Horses and zebras are actually closer relatives than you might think. Both belong to the same genus, Equus, and both trace their evolutionary roots back to horse-like animals that lived in North America millions of years ago. They're both grazers, both live in herds, and both evolved to survive on open grasslands. And physically, the similarities are hard to ignore. Zebras can run at speeds comparable to horses. They're strong enough to carry weight, and their bodies look almost tailor-made for the same jobs we've used horses for thousands of years. Looking at them side by side, you'd probably think zebras should have been just as easy to domesticate as horses. But that's where things get interesting. But humans didn't just wonder about this. They actually tried to turn zebras into working animals. In the 1800s, European colonists in Africa attempted repeatedly and seriously to tame zebras. Lord Walter Rothschild famously trained zebras to pull a carriage through the streets of London, proving they could be trained to perform specific tasks. In parts of colonial Africa, zebras were harnessed to wagons as an experiment, partly because zebras seemed to be immune to diseases like the Setz fly-transmitted trypanosomiasis that killed many domesticated horses and cattle in the region. So if zebras could be trained and were even disease-resistant, why didn't domestication take hold? Here's where things get interesting. Taming and domestication are not the same thing, and confusing the two is where most people get this question wrong. You can teach a single zebra to tolerate people. The same goes for a tiger or an elephant. With enough time and handling, an individual animal can learn to accept humans and even follow commands. That's not domestication. Domestication is a whole different thing. You can get one zebra to obey you, but that doesn't mean you've domesticated zebras. Domestication happens over generations, as humans keep breeding the animals that are calmer, easier to handle, and better suited to living around us. Eventually, those traits become part of the population itself. Rothschild's carriage zebras were tamed individuals. They were not the beginning of a domesticated population, and that distinction is the whole key to this mystery. So the real question becomes, why could horses be domesticated as a species, while zebras, despite individual taming, never cross that line? The answer starts with temperament, and it's more brutal than people expect. Zebras are dramatically more aggressive and unpredictable than horses. Studies of zebra behavior, along with decades of documented attempts to work with them, show that zebras bite and don't let go. Their attacks often target and don't release the way a horse's fear-driven nip does. Zoo statistics consistently report that zebras injure more handlers per year than lions do. Their bite force and reflexes evolved this way for a specific reason. In Africa, zebras share their ecosystem with lions, leopards, hyenas, and wild dogs predators that have hunted equines for millions of years far more intensely than anything horses faced in Eurasia. That environment shaped zebras into incredibly alert, reactive animals. When they sense danger, they're quick to bolt, but when they can't escape, they can fight back hard. A zebra can kick, bite, and strike with surprising force, which makes handling one very different from handling a horse. But that's only part of the story. Even if you could manage a zebra's temperament, there is a second, deeper obstacle, which is their social structure. But temperament isn't the whole story. The way an animal lives and interacts with its own kind matters too. Horses are social herd animals, and their social behavior made them relatively well suited to living alongside humans. They can form strong social bonds, learn from other members of their group, and adapt to a human-controlled environment. This is part of a much bigger pattern. As biologist Jared Diamond pointed out, animals aren't domesticated simply because humans want them to be. A species has to have the right combination of traits, things like diet, growth rate, breeding behavior, temperament, and social structure. Get several of those traits wrong, and even a seemingly useful animal can be almost impossible to domesticate. Zebra social behavior may have made things harder too, but this isn't as simple as saying zebras don't have a leader. Different zebra species have different social structures, and some actually live in fairly stable groups. The bigger issue is that domestication requires humans to repeatedly breed animals in captivity, generation after generation. The animals have to tolerate close human contact, reproduce reliably, and be manageable enough that people can safely select which individuals get bred. And that's where zebras become a much tougher proposition. You might be able to tame one zebra, but turning that into a calm, predictable population would require generations of selective breeding under conditions that are much harder to maintain than they were with horses. But there is another piece of this story that only became clear when scientists started looking at the horse's DNA. In 2021, researchers compared the genomes of hundreds of ancient and modern horses and found that the horses we know today can be traced back to a population in the western Eurasian steppe, around the lower Volga and Don rivers. Their descendants began spreading rapidly across Eurasia around 2200 BCE. And here's the surprising part: horses weren't domesticated as early as you might think. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs had already been living alongside humans for thousands of years. Some much older archaeological sites had seemed to show that horses were domesticated earlier, but the DNA told a more complicated story. Many of those ancient horses belonged to lineages that eventually disappeared rather than becoming the ancestors of today's domestic horses. So why did horses eventually succeed? Because they happened to have a combination of traits that made them unusually well suited to the process of domestication. They're social, they can live in groups, they reproduce in captivity, and most importantly, they can be selectively bred for calmer, more manageable behavior. Over many generations, humans could keep breeding the animals that were easier to handle and better suited to working alongside people. Little by little, those traits became more common in the population. Zebras never went through that same transformation, and it wasn't simply because nobody tried. Their defensive behavior, their difficulty in handling, and the practical challenges of breeding and managing them made the process much harder to carry out on a large scale. So the real difference wasn't that horses were somehow better than zebras. Horses just happened to have the right combination of traits at the right time, and humans were able to build on it. So the difference isn't really about intelligence or strength or even how alike the two animals look. It's about millions of years of separate evolutionary pressure. Horses evolved on the Eurasian steppes, where predator pressure, while real, was less extreme, and their flight response combined with hierarchical herd behavior made them a rare, ideal candidate for human partnership. Zebras evolved in Africa surrounded by some of the most efficient large predators on Earth and became exactly what that environment demanded: fast, alert, and violently defensive. Two animals can look almost interchangeable from the outside, while millions of years of evolution have made them behave very differently underneath. And once horses became domesticated, the consequences were enormous. They allowed people to travel farther, transport heavier loads, work larger areas of land, and move armies and supplies at speeds that simply weren't possible on foot. Over time, horses became deeply woven into trade, warfare, agriculture, and the expansion of civilizations across Eurasia. Zebras never followed that same path, and that's not because they were inferior animals. Quite the opposite. Everything that makes a zebra difficult for humans to work with also helped make it incredibly good at surviving in the wild. So in the end, the story isn't really about why humans chose horses over zebras. It's about how two closely related animals ended up with very different traits, and how, by chance, one of those animals happened to fit the needs of humans remarkably well. The zebra stayed wild while the horse came with us, and that small difference ended up changing human history.